is a co-authored paper with my colleague Tabith. I am presenting it, but then I have the great luxury, if there's anything I can't answer in Q&A, at least I've got someone to help me out. So the paper was born out of the fact that a major component of the work we do at the DGRU involves observing, monitoring, commenting on the process of how judges in South Africa are appointed. As most of you all know, but for the benefit of non-South Africans in the room, that's a process that's changed significantly under the constitutional dispensation. So we now have this very important institution called the Judicial Service Commission, which interviews candidates and, in the cases of many candidates, effectively makes their appointment to our superior courts, and in other cases puts candidates forward who are then appointed with a greater degree of discretion by the President. The President is in all cases the ultimate appointing authority, but in the case of all our judges below Constitutional Court and leadership of the Constitutional Court and the Supreme Court of Appeal, the President is effectively rubber stamping a recommendation given to him by the JSC. So it's a very, very important organization, and I should of course say that the entire paper and our entire research is premised off the idea, as Tabello has indicated, that it really matters fundamentally who our judges are, given the powers and the jurisdiction and so on that our courts have. And I think all those issues are very familiar to us from the conversations at this conference already, so I won't labor that point any further. So as I said, the JSC in South African legal discourses is forever controversial. There are particularly controversies around this individual being appointed or this individual not being appointed, individuals of a certain color not being appointed, and so on. And the debate, whilst there are important issues there, the debate tends to become quite stilted on personalities and on color. But I think there are a lot of other issues that tend to be more hidden, that are really important, that don't get looked at as a result. And in the course of our work of monitoring the JSC, we've been sitting really on a treasure trove of information that we just wanted to try and drill into and look at a bit more closely and see if there were something more interesting and more different that we could say about the process. So in the paper, we are exploring a largely hidden issue, which is centering around the fact that in the JSC regulations, the regulations that regulate its process and procedure, there is an express requirement that a candidate, in order to come before the JSC to then be shortlisted, interviewed, and potentially appointed to the bench, must be nominated for them to come to the JSC. That's fine. I'm in month 3 of renovations, so that's nothing. So the paper then really focuses on 3 components. I'll probably, in the time available, be focusing mostly on the first one. But we're looking at 3 aspects of this. Firstly, who is it that nominates these candidates and these prospective judges, and how successful, for want of a better word, are they? In other words, does there seem to be some kind of greater impact or greater weight that a nomination by a certain organization or individual has that it doesn't from someone else? Is there anything interesting to see there? Also then looking at the role particularly of organizations set up to pursue a transformative mandate, and I'll flesh that out a little bit more later. But what kind of role do organizations play in the nomination process? Is that something that is really actively used and targeted to try and address issues of transformation of the judiciary, another very big and hot topic in South Africa? And then thirdly, touching on some gendered aspects of the nominations process. So this whole idea of nomination marks a very significant change from the pre-constitutional appointment system. This was made very much in the old-style Westminster tap-on-the-shoulder process, appointment formally made by the state president in cabinet, no JSC, no role for nominations, and one of the major criticisms of that system being that there wasn't sufficient scope for input from the broader legal community, legal profession, civil society, etc. So we make the point that this new system, this new constitutional system requiring nomination, this means that a prospective judge's prospects of appointment become conditional very, very early on, before they even get to the JSC's shortlisting committee, before they get to interview, on someone being prepared to nominate them. So far pretty mundane and obvious, and how difficult can it be to get someone to write a letter for you, right? Well, We cite two examples in the paper from the JSC sitting in April this year, where this apparently very mundane procedural requirement actually became a really, really significant problem for two candidates, and not coincidentally two unsuccessful candidates who were not appointed. The first one had been nominated by his secretary and by various other court officials, and this came under very serious scrutiny from the JSC, and there was clear dissatisfaction and unease with the fact that people who were in a subordinate position to the judge had nominated him, and had they not, there would have been no nomination and he would not have been properly before the JSC. The second one was a bright and ambitious young attorney who took it on herself to apply for the position. And when this was uncovered, the question became, well, are you actually properly before the commission because you were supposed to be nominated? She wasn't appointed. That particular issue was not resolved in open sitting. But it was clearly a problem for her candidacy. So this power to nominate is a relatively new one in our system. It's clearly an important one. And so we were very interested to see, well, how is that exercised? What animates? Who actually does this? Who nominates? Why do they nominate? An interesting PowerPoint that no one seems to sort of think about and look at. It's worth perhaps having touched on the attorney who decided to nominate herself. We do touch a little bit on trying to think about, well, what's the rationale for why we have this? Why don't we have an application system? And we do a little comparative look at two other equivalent African jurisdictions who have a significantly similar system to ours in terms of a publicly open JSC-style process, namely Kenya and Zimbabwe. And whereas Zimbabwe, similar to us, requires nomination, or somewhat less extensive nomination process, but does require one, Kenya doesn't. Kenya allows candidates to apply. And so it's something, before we take it too much for granted, our system, it's worth thinking about, well, why do we have this, and are there particular benefits? Is it even a good idea? I mean, one point that springs to mind, of course, is that nomination does give you some sort of light touch initial peer review over candidates. If someone's prepared to put you forward, then someone must think you're up to the job. Of course, if that someone turns out to be your secretary, that raises problems, as I indicated earlier. And there may also be the fact of South Africa and Zimbabwe both using this. It may be part of this drive to change the composition of the judiciary, to transform a judiciary from the place it was before to be something new, something more diverse, something more inclusive, and that maybe nomination plays an important role in that. But of course also, and this is something that if I've got time we'll come back to later, it does also create an extra form of gatekeeping. And if that's potentially a source of exclusion, and it's something that one has to be mindful of and perhaps quite careful of. Why did we think to really explore and look at this issue at all? I think it really germinated from watching a couple of phenomena happen during the JSC's public interviews. So for those who don't know, candidates are shortlisted once their nominations come to the JSC. They're shortlisted candidates interviewed in public. And so we get to see the questions that the commissioners ask and what they appear to think is important in selecting our judges. And it's not uncommon for the identity of the nominator to come under scrutiny. I've mentioned the two problematic examples in April this year, but there are also other instances where it can be commented on positively. Oh, I see such and such an organization has nominated you. Or, I see you used to be a member of such and such an organization, why did they not nominate you? So this plants a seed of an idea of, okay, this seems to matter. The commissioners who are selecting the candidates want to know about this. Let's have a closer look at it. And the other one is not directly relevant to nomination, but it is relevant to the role and how seriously the inputs of organizations like the organized legal profession, the Bar Council and so on, when they make submissions on candidates' suitability for appointment, as they very often do. Candidate X struggles to write judgments in time as an acting judge. Candidate Y has got a lousy temperament and threw a fire at someone in advocates' chambers, whatever. These will be very, very frequently put to candidates, almost inevitably put to candidates during interviews. And some commissioners will even preface this as saying, it's my obligation to put this negative comment by the Bar Council to you. What do you have to say in response to that? So again, it seems from watching the interviews that the JSC is really taking what the organised profession, what people who are making these inputs to them quite seriously. So this again prompts the question, well, what sort of impact does that have on the nomination process? So we developed this tentative proposition, which is that it seems to matter not just that you are nominated, but who that nominator was. And so we wanted to see if we could explore anything about, does this seem to make a difference to the outcome? Does it make a difference to your chances of being appointment if organisation X nominates you or not? And that in turn, thank you, led us to a further consideration, which is the role that organisations such as Black Lawyers Association, BLA, National Association of Democratic Lawyers, NADEL, Advocates for Transformation, AFT, these are many organisations that are expressly mandated and set out to try and address issues around, amongst others, the transformation of the judiciary, changing the demographic composition of the judiciary. And I'm sure many, if not all of you know, we came from a pre-constitutional situation of an entirely white, almost entirely male judiciary. Section 174(2) of the Constitution requires that to be changed, requires the judiciary, or requires that when judges are appointed, that demographic composition of the country is taken into account. So we wanted to look at organizations that specifically have that sort of transformative mandate and say, all right, well, how does that then come into play at nomination? Are they, in other words, not just talking the talk, are they walking the walk? Are they taking action to make sure that candidates are being nominated and coming before the JSC who will further that transformative mandate? And are there blind spots in that? I mean, it's been an observation that we make in the paper that is fairly, you don't have to look too closely to see it, that the issue of gender transformation has tended to play very much second fiddle to the issue of transformation along racial lines. How does that play out when it comes to the nomination process? We've seen a change in the numbers in the judiciary as far as the appointment of black judges, broadly defined, going from pretty much zero at 1994 to making up about over 60% of the judiciary now. Women have gone from, well, one woman judge, I think it was at 1994, to now around 30%, and it's only just crept over 30% in the last couple of years. So gender has lagged behind. What's going on in the nomination process with that? So how do we go about doing this? Well, as I said, we've been sitting on this vast body of information. We get the candidate's full pack of documents from the JSC in each round, including the nomination letter. So we work through this range of documents in the JSC sittings between October 2010 and April 2016. So it's a 5 years, give or take, time range. We're looking at candidates for the High Court and the equivalent superior courts, such as Labour Court, Electoral Court, etc. 2 exclusions to note, one being the Constitutional Court, the other being judicial leadership, highest judicial leadership, in other words, Chief Justice, Deputy Chief Justice, and President and Deputy President of the Supreme Court of Appeal. The reason we've done that, in short, is that those appointments, as I touched on earlier, are done differently. The JSC's role is less powerful, therefore, on our reading of it at least, the importance of the nomination getting to the JSC is somewhat diluted. For Constitutional Court, the JSC sends 3 names, more than the number of vacancies, to the President. The President then has an open discretion to choose from that. For the judicial leadership, the President and Deputy President of the SCA is simply appointed by the President after consulting the JSC. Similar process for Chief Justice and Deputy Chief Justice, but including consultation with other political parties in Parliament. So it seemed to us to be quite substantially different, and therefore we excluded those positions. And another important point that one also should highlight, and I've touched on this shortlisting question, we're looking at candidates that are nominated and shortlisted. We don't know about candidates who are nominated and not shortlisted. That's a big transparency gap in our appointments process. Basically, nothing is known about that. So anyone who didn't make the shortlist, we simply don't know about and don't have the documentation for them. So then we tabulated the identity of who these nominators were, as we were particularly interested in looking at the role of organizations involved in the organized legal profession, such as Nadal, BLA, and so forth. We divided the survey between both individual and institutional nominators. We then looked at what sort of success rate, that's not a very statistically good term, but for want of a better one, i.e. what were the numbers like in terms of who ultimately gets appointed from those list of nominated candidates. And these results were interesting. They had to be interesting, but they were somewhat more prosaic and less dramatic than we were expecting them to be. We were expecting, I think, maybe that we would get some big headline finding that Organization X had some massive runaway success rate in the candidates they nominated and others didn't. Didn't turn out to be that way. So total number of candidates in that survey period, with all the exclusions, we had 339 nominees. I really should have had a PowerPoint for this, so just bear with me. For 155 judicial vacancies. Note that you can have multiple nominators, so this is not all going to, it's going to sound funny and sound like it doesn't add up, but this is how it was. We had 287 nominations being made by 204 individual nominators, most of these being judges, lawyers, academics. And what was really striking here is that there was a large number of people making very few nominations. In fact, there were only, where are my numbers? Thank you, 5. Only 5 individuals made more than 5 nominations. The most frequent nominator is the now Judge President of KwaZulu-Natal, Judge Japie, who made 7. And I should state, because as Judge President, he sits on the JSC, but these were all before he became Judge President. So it's really very, very few individuals nominate on a large scale, certainly as we'll see compared to the organizations. We start, and I think there's a lot more that we can still do with this data, but from what we've done so far, what was interesting is to start aggregating by category. So when you put advocates together, they become the largest group, as it were, among the individuals. There's 81 nominations from advocates collectively. And in addition, some provincial bar associations also nominate. And this is perhaps only to be expected, as advocates are in court all the time and they are well placed to make those kind of calls. Interestingly, the General Counsel of the Bar, as an organization, doesn't nominate anybody. We didn't find a single GCB nomination. Organizations, it's a slightly different picture. Here we have 221 nominations being made by 51 organizations, so you can really see the numbers start changing a bit. Of these, BLA were the most prolific nominators, 58 candidates, Nadal 44, the South African chapter of the International Association of Women Judges 16, South African Women Lawyers Association 11, and Advocates for Transformation 10. Now, as for the success rates, and we probably need to think through methodology here more carefully, because of course it's going to be very difficult to say that there's a causative link between whether someone nominated and whether that person was ultimately appointed. But happily for us, even on the numbers, there doesn't seem to be a very strong pattern coming through. Of course, for the individuals, this very small sample size is going to make it difficult to draw too many conclusions from that either. Judge Japie's success rate is 4 candidates out of 7. 2 of the advocates have success rates of 4 out of 5, 3 out of 5, but these are obviously very small numbers. So one has to think through how much of a conclusion one can draw from that. What I did find interesting is that if you aggregate nominations by a category, if you aggregate all the nominations made by individual judges, that is 32 successful nominations out of 47, so that's about a 68% hit rate, which is considerably higher than the kind of numbers we see elsewhere. And that, again, is on one level entirely to be expected. You would expect a judge's view about whether someone is suitable to be a judge to carry a lot of weight. And in fact, one might even have expected that number to be higher. Initial reaction is that, well, maybe it's actually a good thing that that's not too high, and perhaps it suggests that there's still an independent mind and independent weighing of issues being applied by the JSC. They're not just rubber stamping things coming from the judiciary, and we're avoiding a juristocracy being created, perhaps. Among the organizations, is really, the numbers hover around 50%, BLA 21 out of 58, Nadal 15 out of 44, the IAWJ 7 out of 16, and so forth. So again, these organizations nominate very large numbers of candidates. There's about a 1 in 2 chance of success at best. So as I say, this wasn't quite the picture that we expected to find, but initial gut reaction about that, well, that kind of feels like quite a good thing as well, I think. And we'll still think through this a bit more fully. But it feels to be a good thing for the appointment process that there aren't certain organizations whose nomination appears to make you a shoo-in for judicial office. That may have all kinds of problems along, gatekeeping lines and along what role the JSC was actually playing. So the fact that we have these kind of numbers, first reaction seems to be good. How long have I got left?
1 minute.
One. Okay. So okay, we did also do a little look, as I said, looking at sort of the transformative mandate of the organizations, looking at how this matched up to what they were doing. A very quick headline from that is that we only had 2 of the organizations responding to the survey that we did, where we asked them to explain in a lot more detail how their processes worked, how do they nominate, how do they go about canvassing members and this kind of thing. So only BLA and the IAWJ have responded to that at this point. From those 2, they seem to walk the walk, I must say. BLA particularly concerned with empowering black lawyers, and 56 of their 58 nominees are indeed black lawyers. The IAWJ, of the 16 nominees, they were all past and present members of that organization, and all of them were women. So again, they seem to walk the walk. But what was also encouraging is when one looks at the reasons given for nomination, there are broader considerations at play than simply race and gender. There's a lot of discussion of leadership qualities where appropriate. There's a lot of discussion about concern, demonstrated concern, and dealing with social justice issues and so forth. So that's also an encouraging sign that it seems to not be suitability for the bench is not being considered purely on a narrow demographic basis, which is good. It's a brief comment. Tabitha will hate me for having relegated this so close to the end of non-naught minutes, but we do touch on some of the gender dynamics of the nominations, and there are just some things to be wary about here. Nomination and that initial gatekeeping, that may become a handicap for women, bearing in mind some of the stereotypes and the perceptions about perceived unsuitability, perceived incompetence of women in the legal profession, issues of briefing patterns in the legal profession, the quality of work to which women lawyers are exposed and are getting experience. That may start becoming a problem when peers and contemporaries, who may not see them in the same light as some of their male colleagues, are then the effective gatekeepers who need to nominate them to come forward. So that may be a bit of a blind spot in our system that we need to alert ourselves to. And another final one is the question of acting judges, which is a complete sine qua non for appointment. You have to have acted as a judge before you're appointed. The appointment of those acting judges is done in an entirely untransparent way, and at this point not on any sort of generally agreed or shared criteria, and is very much rife for patronage in the discretion of the judge presidents. And again, looking at some numbers there, it looks very much like there's a big problem with the number of women getting acting experience, which in turn has a follow-on effect to your prospect of being appointed. I will stop there. Thank you.